Morning, page 414, chapter 15, Punishments. Among the many joyous renunciations brought us by the New World were the renunciation of exploitation, the renunciation of colonies, the renunciation of obligatory military service, the renunciation of secret diplomacy, secret assignments and transfers, the renunciation of secret police, the renunciation of divine law, and many, many other fairy tale renunciations in addition, but not, to be sure, a renunciation of prisons. They didn't break down the walls, but merely inserted a new class content inside them. However, there was an unqualified renunciation of punishment blocks. That pitiless torture which could have been conceived only by the hate-filled minds of bourgeois prison keepers. The corrective-labor code of 1924 did allow. It is true, the isolation in separate cell of especially troublesome prisoners, but it warned the separate cell must in no wise resemble a punishment cell. It must be dry, well lit, and provided with the appurtenances of sleeping. At that point, it must have seemed ridiculous, not only to the prison keepers, but to the prisoners themselves, that for some reason or other there was no punishment cell, that it should have been banned. The corrective-labor code of 1933, which was in effect, i.e. not in effect, until the beginning of the 60s, turned out to be even more humane. It forbade even isolation in separation cell. But this was not because the times had become more complacent, but because other gradations of intricate punishment had by this time been mastered and adopted by following the path of experiment. In them, it was not loneliness, but the collective that drove you mad. And on top of that, those who were being punished had to bend their backs. Point. Strict regimen companies, RURs, which were subsequently replaced by strict regimen barracks, BURs, which were penalty work brigades, and strict regimen camp compounds, ZURs, penalty compounds. And sometime later, and somehow unnoticed, they added not punishment cells, oh no, but, quote, penalty isolators, Ch15. For, if you didn't intimidate the prisoner, if there was no further punishment you could apply, how could he be compelled to submit to the regimen? And where could you put the captured fugitives? What was the Ch15 given for? For whatever they felt like. You didn't please your chief. You didn't say hello the way you should have. You didn't get up on time. You didn't go to bed on time. You were late for roll call. You took the wrong path. You were wrongly dressed. You smoked where it was forbidden. You kept extra things in your barracks. Take a day, 3, 5. You failed to fulfill the work norm. You were caught with a broad. Take 5, 7, 10. And for work shirkers, there was even 15 days. And even though, according to the law, what law? 15 days was the maximum in penalty cells, though according to the corrective-labor code of 1933, even that was impermissible. This accordion could be stretched out to a whole year. In 1932, in GULag, there is something Averbakh writes about black on white, and they used to give 1 year of Ch15 for self-mutilation. And if one bears in mind that they used to refuse treatment in such cases, that they used to put They used to put a sick, wounded person in a punishment cell to rot for a whole year. What was required of Shizlo? It had to be A, cold, B, damp, C, dark, D, starvation. Therefore, there was no heat. The pie, not even when the temperature outside was 22 degrees below Fahrenheit. They did not replace the missing glass panes in the winter. They allowed the walls to get damp, or else they put the penalty block isolator in moist ground. The windows were microscopic, or else there were none at all, which was more usual. They fed a Stalin ration of 10.5 ounces a day and issued a hot meal consisting of thin gruel only on the 3rd, 6th, and 9th days of your imprisonment there. But at Vol.2, they only gave 7 ounces of bread and a piece of raw fish in place of a hot dish on the 3rd day. This is a framework in which one has to imagine all the penalty cells. It is very naive to think that the penalty cell has a necessity to Karanak Sala at a temperature of minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit. The punishment cell was a sodden frame of logs. The free physician, Andreev, said, "I, as a physician, declare it possible to put a prisoner in that kind of punishment cell. Let us leave the entire archipelago." At the same Vol.2 in 1937, the punishment cell for work shirkers was a log frame without a roof, and in addition there was a plain hole in the ground. Arnold Rappaport lived in a hole like that. To get shelter from the rain, they used to pull some kind of rag over themselves, like Diogenes in a barrel. Here is how they were fed. The jailer came out of the gatehouse, but with the bread rations, and called the men inside the log frame. "Come out and get your rations." But no sooner did they stick their heads out of the log frame that the guard on the watchtower aimed his rifle. "Stop, I'll shoot." And the jailer acted astonished. "What, you don't want your bread? Well then, I'll leave." And he simply hurled the bread and fish down into the pit in the rain-soaked clay. In the Marines' camp, as in many others, of course, there was snow on the walls of the punishment cell, and in such and such a punishment cell, prisoners were not allowed to keep their then camp clothes, but were forced to undress to their underwear. Every half hour the jailer would let down the food shelf in the door and advised, "I.V. Shved, hey, you won't last. You'll die. You would do better to go out logging." And Shved decided he was right, and that he would have the sheet pulled over his face more quickly if he stayed. He went out into the woods. Out of 12.5 years in the camps, Shved spent a total of 148 days in punishment cells, and had been punished for everything one could imagine: for refusing to be an orderly in India, the hoodlums' barracks. He got 6 months in a penalty camp for refusing to allow himself to be transferred from a well-fed agricultural work party to logging. He was sentenced to a second time for economic counter-revolution. 5814 got another 10 years. Any thief not wanting to go to penalty camp could strike the convoy chief, knock his revolver out of his hands, and he would be sent nowhere. The peaceful political prisoner, however, had no way out. He would have his head forced down between his legs, In the Kolyma in 1938, the punishment cells for the thieves were heated, unlike those for the 58th. The BURs, the strict regiment barracks, were for longer imprisonments. Prisoners were kept there for a month or 3 months, for a half a year, or without any limit to their term, simply because they were considered dangerous. If you got yourself on the blacklist, you would be pushed into the BUR the first opportunity, every May Day and every November holiday, wherever there was an escape or any other unusual camp happening. The BUR could be the most ordinary kind of barracks, set apart and fenced off by barbed wire, and the prisoners in it being taken out daily to the harvest and the most unpleasant work in the camp. It could also be a masonry prison inside the camp with a full prison system, with beatings of prisoners summoned one by one to the jailer's headquarters. A favorite method that didn't leave marks was to be able to beat with a felt boot and a brick inside it, with bolts, bars, locks, and peepholes on every floor, the concrete floors to the cells, and the additional separate punishment cell for inmates. This was exactly what the Akibatsu's BUR was like. Although they had the first type there as well, the prisoners confined in it were kept in cells and without sleeping shelves. They slept on the floor, on padded jackets and pea jackets. A muzzle was made of sheet iron, completely covered the tiny little window below the ceiling. There were nail holes in it, but in the winter the snow covered even these, and it became totally dark in the cell. The electric light was not turned on during the day, which meant that day was darker than night. There was never any ventilation of the cell. For a half a year in 1950, the prisoners were not taken out even one fresh air walk, and so this BUR was very like a camp. The prisoners had to urinate inside their cell instead of being taken out to the toilet. The hauling out of the big latrine barrel was considered a privilege by the cell orderlies, because it meant a chance to gulp down some fresh air, and a bath was a holiday for everyone. The cell was tightly packed. There was room only to lie down, but not to stretch your legs, and this for a half a year. The gruel was water, there were 21 ounces of bread, and not a crumb of tobacco. If anyone got any parcel from home when he was in the BUR, anything in it which would spoil was written off. The administration grabbed it off, or else sold it cheap to the trustees. And the rest was put into storage to be kept for many, many months. Wherever such a special regiment prisoners were taken out to work again, they would get a move on to avoid being locked up again. Sometimes, in this suffocation and immobility, the prisoners just couldn't stand it any longer, particularly those assimilated to the thieves' law, who were nervous and self-assertive. Thieves who go to Akibatsu's were also considered 58th and had no special privileges. The most popular dodge of the BUR prisoners was to swallow the aluminum tablespoon provided for lunch. Everyone who did this was x-rayed, and only when it had been determined that he was not lying, that he really had a spoon inside him, they would put him in the hospital and cut open his stomach. Lyoshka Karnuki repeated the spoon-swallowing caper 3 times, and there was nothing left of his stomach. Kolya Salapayev played insane. He hanged himself one night, but the other lads were there and saw him by agreement, tore down the noose, and he was taken to the hospital. Someone else contaminated a thread by pulling it between his teeth, and then inserted it with a needle under the skin on his leg. Infection. Hospital. He didn't care whether it was gangrene or not, anything to get out of there. But the convenience of also getting some work out of the punished prisoner compelled the boss to set them apart in individual penalty compounds, the ZURs. In the ZUR, in the first place, the food was worse. For 4 months at a time, there might be no second course, and the bread ration was reduced. In the bath, in the winter, there was a broken window, and women barbers, in their padded cotton trousers, padded jackets, used to crop the naked prisoners. There might be no mess hall, but they didn't hand out the gruel in the barracks either. You had to go to the kitchen and get it, and carry it to the barracks through the frost, and eat it there, cold. The prisoners died in droves, and the clinic was filled with the dying. The mere enumeration of penalty compounds will someday constitute a historical investigation of its own, but the more so because it will not be easy to carry out. Everything is being erased. Here is a kind of work they assigned the penalty compounds: harvesting hay 20 miles from the camp compound, where the prisoners would be quartered in shacks made of hay and had to scythe in swamps with their feet always in water. When they had friendly guards, they could gather berries while they were at work. Vigilant guards would shoot to kill, but they picked the berries anyway. They so wanted to eat, or laying up silage in the same swampy place, amid clouds of mosquitoes, without any protection from them. Your face and neck were eaten up, covered with scabs, and your eyelids were swollen. A man almost went blind. Or they might be sent to dig peat in the basin of the Ch15 river in the winter. They had to open up the frozen strata of silt with a heavy sledgehammer and remove them, take the partly thawed peat from beneath them, and then haul it half a mile uphill on sledges. Doing the pulling themselves, the camp used to look after its horses, or they might be sent to an ordinary earth-moving camp near Vorkuta, for instance. And then, too, there was the favorite penalty work, a lime quarry, and the calcining of lime, and the stone quarries. There was no room to list everything. All the heaviest of the heavy job, all the most unbearable of the unbearable jobs. That was a penalty isolator. In every camp had its own. The favorite candidates of the penalty compounds were religious believers, stubborn prisoners, and thieves. Yes, thieves. Here the great system of indoctrination broke down because the inconsistency of the local instructors. They kept whole barracks of nuns who had refused to work for the devil. The penalty camp for prisoners under convoy at the Peshawar State Farm. They held them in a penalty block up to their knees in water. In the autumn of 1941, they gave them all 5814, economic counter-revolution, and shot them. They sent the priest Father Victor Shipovalnikov there on charges of conducting religious propaganda, and had he celebrated Vespers, For 5 nurses on Easter Eve, they sent impudent engineers and other brazen intellectuals there. They sent fugitives who had been caught, and also, with sad hearts, they sent socially friendly elements who refused to assimilate the proletarian ideology. Because of the complex mental task of classification, we will not reproach the administration for its sometimes unwitting confusion. For to the children's colony from Carabas, for example, they sent 2 cartloads of religious women to the children's colony to look after the camp children there, and at the same time they sent some women thieves and syphilitics to the Dolinka penalty sector, conspied. But they got muddled over those things to put on which cart, and the syphilitic women thieves were sent out to look after the children and the nuns to the penalty isolator. They realized what had happened, but left them where they were. And often prisoners were sent to penalty compounds for refusal to become informers. The majority died there and naturally cannot speak for themselves, about themselves. And the murderers from state security are even less likely to speak to them. Soil scientist Grigoriev was sent to a penalty zone for that, but he survived. Also the editor of the Estonian agricultural magazine, Elmar Nigis. There were stories of women in this context too. It is impossible to reach a sufficiently balanced judgment on these stories because some intimate element always remains hidden from us. However, here is the story of Irina Miguel, as she told it herself. She worked as a typist for the administrative section of the Ukhta State Farm. In other words, as a very comfortably established trustee, heavy-set and imposing, she wore her hair in long braids that wrapped around her head. And partly for convenience, she ran around in a wide Oriental-style trousers and a jacket cut like a ski jacket. Whoever knows camp life will understand what an enticement this was. A security officer, Junior Lieutenant Sidorenko, expressed a desire to get more intimately acquainted. And Miguel replied, "I would rather be kissed by the lowliest thief in all of camp. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. I can hear your baby crying in the next room." Repulsed by her outburst, the security officer suddenly changed his expression and said, "Surely you don't think that I like you. I merely want to put you to the test. So here's the way it is. You must collaborate with us." So she refused and was sent to penalty camp. Here are Miguel's impressions from the first night she spent there. In the women's barracks, there were nuns and women thieves. 5 girls were walking around wrapped in sheets, playing cards the day before. The women thieves had gambled and lost the girls' clothes, so had ordered them to take them off and turn them over. Suddenly, a band of men thieves came in with a guitar in his underpants and felt hats. They sang their thieves' song like some sort of serenade. And all at once, some other men thieves ran in a rage, grabbed one of their own wenches, threw her on the door, beat her with a bench, and trampled her. She screamed, but they couldn't scream anymore and stopped. No one interfered, and everyone just sat there and acted as if they didn't notice what was going on. Later, the medical assistant came in. "Who beat you up like?" "I fell off the bunk," I answered the beaten-up girl. "At cards that same evening, they got lost, Miguel, but she was saved by the bitch, Vaska the crooked." He squealed to the chief, and the chief took Miguel to spend the night at the gatehouse. The penalty work parties, like Parma Miroblag, in the depths of the taiga were also often regarded as penalty assignments, both for enlisted men and in the guards, or for officers and offenders who were also sent there. Even more often, however, they substituted trusty guards. If there was no law and no justice in the ordinary camps, then all the more don't look at them in the penalty camps. Thieves played their dirty tricks just as they had pleased, and went around openly with knives. The Vorkuta earth-moving camp in 1946, and the jailers hid from the thieves outside the camp compound, and this was a time when the 58 still considered a majority. At the penalty camp of Dushanbe, near Peshawar, the thieves burned down 2 barracks out of mischief, stopped the cooking, drove away the cooks, and cut the throats of 2 officers. The remaining officers there, even under threat of being demoted to the ranks, refused to enter the camp compound. In cases like this, the chiefs saved themselves by resorting to the maxim, divide and conquer. They appointed as commandant of Dushanbe a bitch urgently brought in with his assistance from somewhere else. The very first night, he and his gang knifed 3 thieves, and things began to quiet down a little. It takes a thief to catch a thief, as a proverb has long since foreseen. The fathers of the archipelago have, in accordance with the progressive doctrine, multiplied these socially friendly elements beyond all rhyme and reason, to the point where they themselves are being choked, could find no other way out of the situation than to split them up and stick them on each other in knife battles. The war between the thieves and bitches which shook the archipelago in the post-war years. Of course, despite all their apparent bravado, the thieves themselves also had a hard time in penalty situations. This kind of debauchery was their way of trying to break it out somehow. As with all parasites, it was more advantageous for them to live among those they could suck on. Sometimes the thieves would cut off their fingers so as not to have to go to penalty work, as, for example, at the celebrated Vorkuta lime factory. Certain recidivists in the post-war period actually had inscribed in their sentence to be confined at the Vorkuta lime factory. The screws were being turned from on high. There was everyone around with knives. The bitches and the thieves cut each other up every day. The cook, a bitch, served as he pleased. Some got thick, some got thin, and some merely got a whack on the head with the ladle. The work assigner went about with an iron reinforcing rod and killed men on the spot with one single whistling blow. The bitches kept the young boys for pederasty. There were 3 barracks. The barracks of the bitches, the barracks of the thieves, and the barracks of the suckers, 100 in each. The suckers worked down below near the camp with a limestone quarry where the lime was extracted. This was carried in the hand barrows and up the cliff, where it was poured into cones, leaving flues on the inside. The lime was roasted, then they had to spread out the burning lime amid smoke, soot, and lime powder. In the Dajida camps, the penalty sector of Bayangol was famous. Tiravuchi, the penalty camp of Crossleg, even before it had any penalty prisoners, they had sent a working nucleus of 150 strong sluggers who had not committed any infractions. It's all very well to talk about penalty labor, but the chiefs have to fulfill their plan regardless, so they simply condemned ordinary sloggers to the penalty camp. They even sent thieves and also long-termers under Section 58 heavyweights, and the thieves were scared, and these heavyweights too, because they had 25-year sentences, and in a post-war situation, they could kill off a thief without having their prison term extended, and it was no longer considered, as in the canals, a sally at the end of the class enemy. The working day at Ravucci was supposed to be 11 hours, but in fact, with the marching 3 or 4 miles to the forest and back, it turned out to be 15 hours altogether. The veil was at 4:30 a.m. and they got back to camp compound toward 8. The Czechs quickly began to become last leggers, and as a result, there were work shirkers. Following the general lineup in the morning, they lined up these malingerers up in the club, and the work assigner went down and picked out some for a workover. These malingerers in rope sandals, shod for the season, 76 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, in thin pea jackets, were pushed outside the compound, and 5 police dogs were set on them with orders to get them. The dogs tore them, clawed them, and knocked them down. The dogs were then called off, and a Chinese came up on a young bull harnessed to a honey wagon, loaded the malingers in it, carried them off, and dumped the cart down the roadbed into a hollow below. Down there waiting was Brigadier Lyosha Sloboda, who beat the malingerers with a club until they got up and began to work for him. He credited their output to his own brigade, while they got only 10.5 ounces each and a penalty block ration. Whoever thought up that whole graduated system was a real little Stalin. Galina Yosifovna Syriakova, why don't you write about that? Why is it that your heroes, sitting there in camp, do nothing, work nowhere, and only talk about Lenin and Stalin? It was virtually impossible for an ordinary slogger from the 58th to survive such a penalty camp. At the penalty work sub-party of Sevgeldorle, Chief Colonel Kluchkin, there was cannibalism in 1946-47. People were cut up into meat, cooked and eaten. This was on the heels of our people's earth-shaking historic victory. Colonel Kluchkin, where did you build yourself your retirement villa? Thank you for listening. Have a great day.